Hello, welcome to How to Get a Doctorate and Do a Dissertation in Record Time. In this video, I want to do two things. I want to briefly review what I said in the previous video about the nature of doctoral programs. And then I want to speak to what might be thought of as the structure of the traditional dissertation. Remember, you have to get a dissertation done in order to get a doctorate. A doctorate requires you to write a dissertation. And a dissertation is really an effort to achieve or to get some knowledge about something in which you have an interest. And I'll speak more about that in just a moment. But by way of review of what I've already said, let me repeat that a doctoral program has 5 major steps to it. The first of which is coursework. You're going to have to do about 20 courses to get your doctorate. Sometimes a couple less, sometimes more, but about 20 courses. Then after that, you'll need to take what's called comprehensive exams. These are exams over the course material, or in some cases, in some universities, R1s, Research 1 universities, you need to do a substantial paper around the topic in which you have an interest. That's the second step, the comprehensive exams. The third step is you need to do a proposal. A proposal is essentially a document, not necessarily long, could be as short as a few pages, or it could be longer, depends on what program you're in. You have to do a proposal which says basically, common sense terms, what do you want to know, and why you want to know it, or why is it worth knowing, and what do you plan to do to find out what you want to know. That's what a dissertation proposal is when broken down to common sense terms. And then you have to write the dissertation. That's the fourth step. And finally, once you've written the dissertation and you have a draft, a defensible draft, you need to go into a sit-down situation with 3 or 4 or more faculty and defend it. And then once you've defended the dissertation, you are, for all intents and purposes, a doctor. So that's the overview of the 5 major steps of a doctoral program: the coursework, the comprehensive exams, the proposal, the writing of the dissertation, and finally the dissertation defense. Now, having done that review, let me turn now to a topic about the structure of the traditional dissertation. And it's important to keep this structure in mind. A traditional dissertation has 5 major parts to it. If you want to call them chapters, you can do that. But the 5 chapters are, first, the problem statement. Okay? And this essentially says what you want to know, why it's worth knowing, why do you want to know it, basically that's what a problem statement says. A few other things I'll get into, but basically what do you want to know and why do you want to know it? Why is it worth knowing? The second part or chapter of a dissertation is the literature review and the conceptual framework. A literature review basically answers the common sense question: who else besides me has wanted to know what I want to know, or something like what I want to know, and what did they do to find out? That's the literature review. The third part or chapter of the dissertation is what's called the methodology chapter. A methodology chapter essentially answers a common sense question as well, and that common sense question is, what am I going to do? What am I actually going to do to find out what I want to know? And then the fourth chapter of the dissertation is the reporting of the data analysis and findings, the reporting on the data that you get, whatever that data might be, and we can talk about the kinds of data there are in due course. But it's the data analysis and the conclusions from the analysis, the basic findings from the analysis. And then the last chapter of the dissertation is the summary conclusions and recommendations for future research. Now again, of these 5 parts, the problem statement, the lit review and conceptual framework, the methodology section, the data analysis and conclusions or findings, and then the summary conclusions and major findings. These 5 parts constitute the traditional dissertation. And as I suggested when first going through them, each of these 5 parts answers a common sense question. The problem statement answers the common sense question, what do I want to know, and why do I want to know it? Why is it worth knowing? Why is it worth your trouble to go and do the research? And why is it worth somebody else's trouble, namely your dissertation committee, to read about the report on what research you've done? So you need to say in the problem statement, you need to say what it is you want to know, and then you need to give the rationale for why it is you want to know what you think is important to know, okay? And then in the second, the literature review and conceptual framework, the common sense question is, who else besides me has wanted to know what I want to know? What did they find out? And equally important, what did they do to find out? And then the conceptual framework, common sense question is, given what I want to know, given what I've learned, what others have found out about it, what do I expect to find when I do my own research? That's essentially the conceptual framework. I will say more about all of these things in due course, but I want to give you an overview. You need to have a big picture before you can get into the weeds of the thing and understand it. So that's the common sense. And these common sense questions, by the way, are to help you orient yourselves to each of the 5 major parts of the traditional dissertation. So you can remind yourself when you get into the literature, which is going to be extensive, probably more than just one body of literature, you can remind yourself what it is that you're doing and you're trying to do. When you do a lit review, you're essentially trying to do a report on what's already known about the thing you're interested in or the phenomenon in which you're investigating, okay? And then the third methodology section is essentially a discussion around the common sense question, what are you going to do to find out what do you want to know? And I'll get into the more detail in this, but essentially you can do 3 kinds of things. You can do a qualitative study, a quantitative study, or some mixed method study, which combines the 2. I'll talk about that in due course. Again, the 4th chapter of the dissertation is the data analysis and the findings. And finally, the last chapter, our last part of the traditional dissertation, is the summary, conclusions, and recommendations. And the common sense question to the 4th chapter, the data analysis and findings, are, here's what I found. What did I find? What did I find after I looked to see what I thought would be the case with the things that I was looking at? What did I come up with? What did I find? And finally, the final chapter, common sense questions, are, well, what did I start out wanting to know? What did I find? So what? And what more needs to be done? So the traditional, in reviewing, the traditional dissertation has 5 major parts to it. And each part associated with each of these parts is a common sense question. And so there can be variations from the 5 major parts. Some dissertations will have an extra chapter devoted to the conceptual framework, as when I went through my doctoral program at the University of Chicago, we had 6 chapters and needed to focus a good bit of attention on the conceptual framework, which again is an answer to the common sense question, given what I know, what I want to know, and given what others have found out about it, what is my most reasonable expectation about what I'm going to find when I do my own research? I'll talk more about a conceptual framework in detail when we come to the more microscopic examination of that part of the dissertation. But it is important to keep in mind as you go about the business of trying to do a dissertation that it has 5 major parts and that each major part has associated with it a set of common sense questions. So think about that. Check out my book if you have an interest. It's on Amazon. It is. I'll put a link to below for it, and it is entitled "How to Do a Dissertation in Record Time," using government data. You don't have to use government data, but you can, and I'll speak to that again in a subsequent video, and why that can cut off as much as a year of your dissertation time. Okay. Until then, if you have any questions, put them below and I'll try to answer them in a future video. But until then, take care.